one of the world's great cities, history everywhere. London's Tower Bridge, Big Ben, the peaks of Westminster. History that reaches to the sky. But there are stories down below, too, stories about the man historians say saved the world. Who knew that underneath the British Treasury, Winston Churchill plotted his fight against Adolf Hitler? The Churchill War Rooms, sealed for decades, frozen in time. It's a stunning memorial to a man and his era. And who better to see all this with than someone who has the Churchill blood literally running through her veins?
You want to go into the museum?
Sure. Celia Sands, the great man's granddaughter.
You see, he sat in that chair.
We sat down together in the very room Sir Winston paced all those years ago.
You know, for all of us who get to come into this space, it's pretty exciting. But for somebody who's a member of the family, what's it like? What's it like to be here in this area?
Well, it is, for me, it's amazing to see in the place where he was, and his whole life laid out in the museum. Of course, the War Rooms is a time warp completely, and that's an extraordinary capsule of what was happening during the war. But the museum has so much in it. Every time I come, there's something that I haven't seen before, and so many extraordinary things.
Did he ever talk about being here, running the war almost from here?
Like most people who took part in the war in any way, he wasn't spending his life talking about it. He was someone who looked forward. So he was far more likely to be looking forward than backward.
Which is ironic in a sense that so many people come here to look backward.
Absolutely.
And just yesterday, 5,000 people were through the War Rooms. Last year, more than 500,000 came through here, with those numbers increasing, it seems, each year. Do you have any sense of why that is?
Well, I think people are searching for inspiration and leadership, and he seems to be the iconic leader.
So here we are, 10 meters, that's about 30 feet below ground, below the Treasury building. It's here where they created the War Rooms for Winston Churchill to run the Second World War. It's behind these desks that members of the Churchill cabinet, members of the British Armed Forces sat and strategized the Second World War. Everywhere you look, there are pieces of history. Look at this. Here was the warnings up here explaining to people who were down below what the various alarm systems and signals meant for air raids, for a ground attack, for a gas attack, the different signals that would take place. And then here, one of the many, many fascinating rooms in here, the map room. You can look in to what was the actual room where they had the maps laid out to determine where the attacks were coming, where attacks were being conducted.
You can see how much shipping traffic there was by every single pinhole. It's incredible, really, isn't it?
I speak to you for the first time as Prime Minister in a solemn hour for the life of our country, of our empire, of our allies, and above all, of the cause of freedom.
You know, he wrote in his history of the Second World War about the night that he became Prime Minister, and talked about how he felt that his whole life to that point, and here was somebody well into his 60s, that his whole life had prepared him for this moment. What do you think he was thinking when he said that?
I think he was probably thinking, am I going to be able to do this? And the most important...
He had doubt? He had self-doubt?
Oh, I think he must have had. He did have doubts, I think, but he knew that he couldn't... If he showed that he had any doubt, then no one else would believe in him. He had to, go through it with great confidence and make everyone believe that he knew that he could do it. But he had to keep the faith and carry on and basically follow his own maxim, which was never, never, never give in.
and ensure that whatever he did and whatever he said inspired Britons to feel the same way.
Well, apparently Hitler could make you believe that he could do anything, but Churchill could make you believe that you could do anything. And I think that is something he made every man and woman in the country believe, that they had a role to play. And that was very important.
Nothing is more certain than that every trace of Hitler's footsteps, every stain of his infected and corroding fingers will be sponged and purged, and if need be, blasted from the surface of the earth.
Life underground, preserved, the wax figures modeled after real men.
Did you see the 3 lumps of sugar? When they opened the walls up, they found everything as it was, completely. And this was the man who had brought his 3 lumps of sugar, the officer there.
When I warned them that Britain would fight on alone, whatever they did, their generals told their Prime Minister and his divided cabinet, in 3 weeks, England will have her neck wrung like a chicken. Some chicken. Some neck.
Churchill's political life was one of turmoil, switching parties, switching allegiances, fighting colleagues as often as fighting critics. At his core, he believed in doing what he thought was the right thing, not always the popular thing.
He wasn't a party politician, so therefore he didn't feel he had to toe any line. He was with whichever party he felt where he could actually do the best job or make the best contribution.
That issue about him not being a party politician, we know the history, having crossed party lines a number of times, being
ratted and re-ratted, he said.
Ratted and re-ratted. Anyone can rat, he said, but it takes special talent to re-rat.
Celia Sands is the youngest child of Churchill's eldest daughter, Diana. She was close to her grandfather. She traveled with him a lot in his later years, captured here on a trip to the Mediterranean.
Do you remember that? Do you remember that moment?
I remember it absolutely. We were in Monte Carlo, and these holidays were really peaceful, companionable times when we would go for picnics, driving, or painting trips. And for me, though, it meant that I had to myself for a short time the grandfather the whole world thought they owned.
You said earlier that, like many who went through that experience of the Second World War, that he chose not to focus on it, but to focus on forward thinking. Did you ever sort of kind of test him on that in terms of asking him questions about that time?
There are lots of questions I really wish I'd asked him and I didn't. But the thing is, I was 21 when he died, and when you're 21 you don't think about cross-examining your parents or your grandparents about their lives, really. And it would have been wonderful to have been able to ask him questions.
Like what?
Well, when I started writing books about him, I would love to have been able to ask him questions about his childhood, about when he was in South Africa in the Boer War, and all sorts of things. I mean, he'd had the most incredible adventure story. If he'd never gone into politics, he would have been a sort of hero figure for the sort of Boy's Own magazine.
Journalist, politician, wartime leader, author, Nobel laureate.
Oh, it's extraordinary. I mean, he fitted more into his life than it's possible to believe, really, that anyone could. Of course, but his recipe for that partly was go to bed every afternoon and you'll be able to extend your day.
The Churchill nap.
The Churchill nap.
What has surprised you about studying the life of your grandfather?
Well, I think, firstly, he believed he had a destiny. I mean, he wrote to his mother from India when he was 23 and said, "Bullets don't worry me. I believe I've been put on this earth for a purpose." And that he did have a role. Now, of course, that sounds very arrogant, but that is what he believed, and it ended up that was what it was.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am now nearing the end of my journey. I hope I still have some services to render.
In 1965, at 90, just months after he finally stepped down as an MP, Winston Churchill's extraordinary life came to an end. All Britain stood still.
I think, apart from maybe one or two of the nurses, I'm the only person alive who was actually there when he died.
What do you remember about that?
It was, well, we'd spent 10 days building up, knowing, I mean, first of all, we had his 90th birthday on the 30th of November, and the unspoken thought around the table was that there wouldn't be another one. And just at the beginning of January, he had a terrible stroke, and for 10 days, he was just really lying there. Apparently, some years before, he had said that he was going to die on the same date as his father, Lord Randolph, had died. And I believe that the Queen's private secretary rang my grandfather's private secretary and said, you know, how is he? Because, you know, there's a lot to be arranged, and it was quite clear where everything was heading. And he said, well, you're probably not going to die for another few days. So the Queen's private secretary said, well, how can you tell? Well, he did say he was going to die on the anniversary of his father's death. And so at 8 o'clock on the morning of the 24th of January 1965, almost to the minute, and 70 years after his father had died, he slipped imperceptibly away to meet his maker.
What will your thought be on that day?
I suppose I will be, you know, remembering a very loving grandfather who, for me, was just my grandpapa.
And for the rest of the world?
Well, I think that without him, it would be a very different world now.
Thank you for this.
Thank you very much.